Welcome to the DNA Talks podcast, where we take on the mission of unlocking the code of your genetics. This season is all about you, upgrading your health, not just on the surface, but down to the root cause. Join us as your clinicians at the DNA company investigate your DNA and beyond. The intention of this podcast is to enhance your lifestyle by changing what is in your control. This does not substitute the medical advice given by your personal doctor, therapist, and other healthcare professionals.
Julie Daniluk is a leading voice in the world of holistic nutrition and wellness. Having overcome a life-changing gut infection and a pre-existing disordered eating issue in her 20s, Julie's personal journey shaped her mission to help others heal from chronic pain and inflammation. And through her groundbreaking books like Meals That Heal Inflammation and Hot Detox, she's empowered thousands upon thousands to embrace anti-inflammatory eating. Her work is backed by science, personal experience, and of course, a passion for turning food into medicine. Julie eats like her life depends on it, and she teaches others to do the same. She believes healing begins not only in the gut, but also in the heart and the mind. And her advocacy for breaking free from emotional eating and embracing nourishing foods has earned her a global following. She's featured on countless network television shows, radio programs, and podcasts. Julie passionately shares her message of healing through food, inspiring audiences around the world. She's also a dear friend and clinical colleague of mine. So, folks, whether you're struggling with pain, bloating, got brain fog, or simply want more vitality, Julie's here, and her work offers practical, delicious solutions. Julie, welcome to the DNA Talks podcast.
Oh, thank you, Bryce. It has been a delight to know you for 20 years and to also work alongside you. Thank you.
And I got to say that it's a pleasure's all been mine, because I've also been the receiving end of your delicious cooking, not once or twice, countless times. And it's, not just delicious. I walk away feeling healed. I got to tell you, it's a remarkable experience. Always trying new and delicious things. I don't know where or how you have the time to find all these things, but I got to tell you, congratulations on the latest edition of the book. This is incredible. Edition one of Meals That Heal Inflammation was amazing, but this completely revised, updated edition, why don't we just kick it off there? I mean, you're just one of those endless resources of information around healthy eating, but with this specific undertone of inflammation, which is a medical buzz term of the day for a very good reason, because ultimately this is what, at least at the cellular level, is the cause of all of what ails us, right?
Yes. When you consider, 1 in 4 Canadian women have arthritis at the moment, and 1 in 3 people will have cardiovascular disease, and
Right.
1 in 9 people will often fall to type 2 diabetes. We have all of these major inflammatory issues in our world, and it's so powerful to know that if we get underneath it and solve the causes of inflammation using anti-inflammatory nutrition, that we can see people have complete remission. I've seen it in my practice hundreds of times, to the point where I've started to actually guarantee, when I work with someone, I say, listen, if I can't reduce your inflammation markers in 6 months by 50%, I'll give you your money back. And people are like, what? And it's because I'm having such good success rates.
Referred countless patients to you. The DNA company at large is a huge fan of yours, constantly updating your work at mealsthatheal.ca, which, by the way, for some incredible exclusive book bonuses, you got to go there and check this out. But this thrivewithjulie.com and team, which, you're supporting this wellness community at large, just kudos, because as I guess Socrates once said, it all does start in the gut. And the age old adage, if you don't mind maybe unpacking this for us, you literally are what you eat, or potentially what you avoid.
Yeah, isn't it fascinating that we forget that every bite of food becomes the building blocks of our physical body? Like, how else do we flip over these cells if it's not from the raw materials we take in? And so many people lose sight of that. They just see food as energy. But I see like every fat I take in becomes the phospholipid layer of every cell of your body. And so I just want to have the highest quality building materials coming into my system. And if we really tip the scales with enough nutrients, we can turn off the fire. I've seen
Right.
it.
The fire within, and it's interesting. We often, I suppose, in a cute way to refer to some of our genes on fire. We can dive into a little bit of those a bit later on. Methylation, which may loosely translate for a lot of our followers into inflammation. You run amok or have poor variations within your methylation gene complex. You're more predisposed to inflammation. But, and this is the biggest but that I hear you share all the time, is that you can manage this through what you put into your body, and certainly starting with good food and food that doesn't trigger inflammation. Can't wait to dive into that with you.
Yeah.
I love your social media. It's obvious, but not many people know this, that you come from a background in the dramatic arts, right? You just have this way about you, and you're always happy-go-lucky, and you've found your calling when it's teaching and sharing this information around clinical use of healthy foods. But one that struck me recently, and I invite everyone to check you out at Julie Daniluk, at Julie Daniluk on Instagram. You described having recently had some, I know you're making a bit of a joke around this, but recently having someone say to you that they'd never spend money the way you do, and you're playing yourself. And you ask for some clarity, and you give a couple of statistics of how people often spend their money. Share with us what that was about, and because we deal with this all the time as clinicians in the natural healthcare world, don't we?
Isn't it crazy how many people will say, "Oh, that's too expensive.
Right.
I can't possibly buy a DNA test." And I think to myself how expensive our bad habits are. Like the average person who's smoking is spending $12,000 a year on their smoking habit. If
Right.
you casually drink, just casually, not a heavy drinker, you're spending $3,000 a year. Wow, that's 15 grand that you could spend on your health. So when people say, "Oh, I couldn't possibly afford to eat the way you do," I'm like, "You do know that deli meat is way more expensive than steak?" Like, do you know that potato chips are actually one of the most expensive foods on the planet, boasting up to $5 for 100 grams of
Right.
potato chips? And yet, if we look at the most expensive health foods, they're far below that.
Ironically, paying to harm ourselves. And by
Well,
the way, you're also not this staunch fanatic where isn't in some instances, occasion for the exception. You're not a never ever kind of gal when it comes to recommendations. There's always room, but I think your philosophy, correct me if I'm wrong, stands from the perspective of never make time for that exception, because the exceptions always occur. There's always the birthday party and the wedding, and instances where maybe you'll dip into the potato chip bowl as a sneak. But by and large, the rule is managing inflammation through diet, and it's a very, very logical and very well evidence-based rule. You mentioned a couple of stats at the top. Chronic inflammation, 1 in 2 people, 50% of us, that are over 45 in North America live with chronic inflammation. And this is linked to diseases that you described, but also
mhm,
Alzheimer's. I mean, we're looking at this as
mhm,
type 3,
everything. Yes,
metabolic syndrome of the brain, right?
name it.
Autoimmune.
Arthritis, bursitis, colitis, diverticulitis.
All
I
right.
could build
Anything with itis, right?
a
Autoimmune is an epidemic. Over
Mm,
50 million Americans suffer from autoimmune disease. You're
wow.
triggered by inflammatory foods. There's an
And
economic cost to this, right?
totally
Chronic
when we
pain costs
consider
the US
mm,
over $635 billion annually. That's more than cancer or heart disease combined.
mhm.
And of course, we've referred to this, you talk about this all the time, the silent danger. Many people live with silent inflammation that shows no symptoms but slowly damages their organs, right? So it's clear inflammation is a growing epidemic. That's the underpinning here. And you've spent decades teaching people how to heal naturally. We talked a bit about it in the bio, but what inspired you to dive into this work in the beginning?
I think the number one thing was watching how my grandmother was aging out. So my grandmother followed the work of Paul Bragg and was so youthful and so beautiful. And all of her siblings were 100% falling apart and often dying far before her. She lived to 94. Her skin was stunning. And she just was such an advocate that she really inspired me to dig a little deeper. And then watching some critical people around me get severe arthritis and just not wanting to go down that road and then getting such bad illness myself and going, how can I feel it's like 60 years old when I'm only 30? Like, how can I have this much joint pain and bursitis already? How could I have this much gut inflammation that I have full blown colitis? And then kind of going, okay, I'm going to do whatever it takes to heal my gut, because 70% of our immune system lies across the gut lining. So when we change up our microbiome, when we heal that lining, it creates this beautiful domino effect that truly heals every part of you. And I've got every single inflammatory condition in remission at the moment. So I know it's possible now.
I love that you say in remission, because as we like to teach at the DNA company, we all have genetic predispositions that can trend toward certain chronicities when they flare up and or express themselves. That's what your predispositions typically are. And cure is a very strong word. That is to suggest eliminate entirely and prevent from ever happening again, or turn off genes, which we know isn't possible. You can modify genetic expression and epigenetics, which is what diet's doing so incredibly well, washing over your genes and keeping them at bay. Certainly, at least those that trend and predispose to conditions that are otherwise debilitating. And inflammation, you also describe this in the book, as a natural process that can turn harmful when chronic. So we want to have folks understand what these top 4 causes of chronic inflammation.
Yes.
And people often overlook them. By the way, and there's the acute versus chronic, right? Maybe you can start by
Mhm.
explaining the
Sure.
difference there.
So the body's really, what I love to say about inflammation is the body's emergency healing response system. So let's stop demonizing it. It's just the messenger saying, yo, there's a severe emergency over here. Take a look over here. But what if we don't have the redness, the heat, the swelling, and the pain? As you said, what if it's silent? And the big one that everyone ignores is the loss of function, which is the fifth signal of inflammation being loss of function. So loss of strength, loss of flexibility, loss of memory. That's what we often completely ignore. And when we dive into that and really say, okay, what is causing these 5 symptoms of inflammation? I like to call them the 4 I's, because I've tried to find a way for people to remember them easily. The number one cause everyone knows is injury. You twist your ankle, it may flare up 10 years later because you were a super athlete in high school. You got that really bad injury. Maybe you didn't rest it and completely heal it, sort of nags at you later, that chronic inflammation.
Right.
So acute inflammation, 5 to 7 days, really powerful, important for healing. We'd be dead without it. But then when it turns chronic, that's what we have a problem with. And the injury is not just physical. So I just want to put it out there that emotional trauma is just as impactful. And we see that mostly because there's a huge connection to the vagus nerve. So when people are very traumatized, they're often re-triggered. So say, I'm going to use an example of one of my clients, and I will hide her identity. So her name's Tracy. She has incredible phobia to dogs because she was attacked by a dog when she was 2, and she would have like full body fight or flight every single time she would see a dog. I don't even care if it was a chihuahua. She would just freak right out. So when we realized that her inflammation was very much emotionally based, we got her to actually do some trauma work called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and repatterning. And with a trained psychotherapist, she was able to completely detrigger herself, get out of fight or flight, and have an extraordinary breakthrough where now she can be in a room with even a big dog without her
Wow.
nervous system firing. So that was a huge bonus. But what if you don't have access to that? I've personally had POTS, which is called postural orthostatic
Not
tachycardia.
fun.
Not fun at all. Very scary. Happened after a surgery that was I didn't feel empowered to have the surgery. It was rushed, and I was like forced under the knife. And all of a sudden, when I woke up from that, I had POTS. So,
Wow.
goodness, I figured out that you can treat POTS by stimulating the vagus nerve directly using this really cool device called the Dolphin Neurostimulator. It's something where we slap it on your ear, we slap it on your lower belly, we stimulate the vagus nerve directly, and that caused me to completely put my POTS in remission. So isn't that cool that now we realize underneath that emotional trauma can be the very pinnings of why some people do not resolve, especially gut
Sure.
inflammation.
Sure.
Especially if you're somebody with severe constipation, severe diarrhea, we should definitely look at this cause. I know we have 4 causes, and I've been delving into stuff that's really unusual, but there's 2 of the 4
No,
causes.
I'm so happy you brought that up, and I want to unpack it even a little further in some minutes to come. But I just wanted to mention, very aware of what you're describing. This is one of my favorite little tools
Oh,
as a
neat.
vagal stim goes, and I just put it on my neck here, and it helps to push that big red reset button. You know, when I'm feeling overwhelmed. But the point here is, when there is high chronic stress, that is probably North America's second, killer of all, under, second only to maybe inflammation, that it causes inflammation, right? Chronic stress and high chronic cortisol contributes to this inflammation we're talking about.
I'm actually starting to think it's one of the biggest things.
Right.
And if you keep eating foods that push your cortisol high by pushing your insulin high constantly, because what do we do when we're scared, when we're angry, when we're upset? We run for the starch, we run for the sugar. And that's totally dysregulating your hormonal balance. It's so funny that those sugar spikes and starch, starch causing sugar, because starch becomes sugar within 10 seconds as your amylase works on those starches. We just see that terrible cascade that's going to impact. I love talking about like the three major causes of death being heart disease, neurodegenerative diseases, and cancer. The underpinnings of all 3 of those are metabolic disorders.
Hmm.
So that's why in the book Meals that Heal Inflammation, I truly work on trying to keep people's blood sugar under control as the primary thing. If you have one thing you take away from here, balance your blood sugar. Do anything to keep it under control. And we have some great tips for that.
Sure. And I gotta say, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, the way you described loss of function is brilliant. People often forget, and again, this is what is underlying this epidemic, and it's also what inspired you to dive into this and clarify this for a lot of folks, that you don't have to have the red heat, painful state,
Mhm.
but just a slow, steady, chronic loss of function. Interestingly enough, within the genetic world, genes like ApoE, which in some folks is unfavorable, presenting, with a variant called a 3-4 or a 4-4 variant of that gene. Some excellent research showing, through reverse engineered studies in cohorts of people that have Alzheimer's well diagnosed, a huge majority carry either a 3-4 or 4-4. So it's not fatalistic. It doesn't mean if you have a 3-4-4-4. In fact, we reported the DNA company as it relates to cardiovascular disease, and it plays a role in inflammation. But interestingly enough, evolutionarily, this is hundreds of thousands and millions of years ago, ApoE3-4 or 4-4, that today we partly blame on loss of function in the brain in Alzheimer's, was favorable. It was a favorable gene. This
Mhm.
gene was one in which turned on in the face of acute infection. You'd stepped on something sharp, and bacteria followed very short order into your bloodstream. Having that variation, you were more likely to recover, although you didn't last very long, because you'd probably soon enough be eaten by some predator within your first 20 years. Now, of course, we live into our 80s, sometimes 90s, or even hundreds if we're lucky. Having an ApoE3444 is potentially contributing to chronic disease and inflammation. So that's the paradox when it comes to genes, and knowing is empowering. And you mentioned, stress and unresolved trauma. And of course, sugar. I mean, there's just no more question anymore that sugar causes inflammation, the way you
Sure
described it as
does.
sort of a signaling. And I've heard you talk about this before. It provokes these cytokines, which are basically communicators that provoke or bring inflammation to the area, right?
Absolutely. And that's actually a number 3. We can say that nutritional imbalances, like having too much starch and sugar, will cause hormonal imbalances. So I would say hormonal imbalances are a huge underpinning of inflammation as well. So this is a perfect tie in.
Mhm.
I am just so shocked at how many people don't connect the dots on how their blood sugar being mismanaged is actually in the background of their anxiety, how it's in the background of their mental illness, of their depression. We now know that a high sugar diet can actually cause a 23% greater level of depression risk. Now, that was in men. We don't have enough studies on women, but I will say that when we have a menu that's high in produce, we reduce the risk by 26%. That's a 50% swing by going on an anti-inflammatory menu, because we cut out the sugars and we're putting in those 7 to 10 veggies per day. And we're amazed at that much fiber providing the short chain fatty acids that help your microbiome proliferate positive bacteria that is truly going to change your ability to make more serotonin. Instead of preventing serotonin uptake like we see, why not actually allow your microbiome to produce the amount of adequate serotonin, because it's all made in the gut. It's an inside job. As you know, 90% of our serotonin and dopamine, we've got to make these neurochemicals from the good bacteria.
Of course, your body's a pharmacy. Give it the right ingredients, it knows what to do to make the right
Yeah.
naturally occurring drugs. Give it the wrong ingredients, and all you're going to do is add fuel to the fire and cause challenge and take away resources, including energy, to do the right stuff. In fact, we talk about this all the time. You and I are on the same page. There's no miracle to natural medicine, for that matter, or for that matter, anti-inflammatory foods. It is the body's ability to do what it should do best on its own, given the right ingredients. You said it at the top. And, there's a lot of buzz terms around the inflammation epidemic. There's the inflammasome, which is a critical component of the immune system you've alluded to. There's, cytokines, which are our body's natural response to infection, bacterial and viral, et cetera, fungal. There's meta-inflammation. There's, oxidative stress, chronic inflammatory diseases, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But leaky gut syndrome, something I wanted to tie in here, because you mentioned gut dysbiosis now a few times. Explain the connection between the gut and inflammation, and how do we know if our gut's out of balance?
You are truly queuing me out, because the last, besides infection, which we can dive deep into, the last point I want to make is that irritation of the gut lining is actually a huge cause of inflammation. So irritation coming from toxicity and coming from like harmless food that you might be majorly allergic to. So if you have any sort of allergic reaction, you have a much higher response of histamines, and you often see the integrity of we have an unfortunate gapping that can occur where food particles can get into the bloodstream and cause immune complexes that lodge in the joints and cause joint pain, that lodge in the muscles and cause muscle pain. And that's why we really see a direct tie between leaky gut and, say, fibromyalgia and unfortunate chronic fatigue and chronic arthritis and other types of joint pain. So that's why when we get rid of the foods that we are allergic to, and that's a very personal thing, we have to keep a food journal, or we have to go for food allergy testing or food intolerance testing, because there's different antibodies involved there. Then once we take those out, we clear the system out for 6 months. We often see a dramatic reduction in joint pain, muscle pain. And I cannot believe how consistent the results are, because we will help the actual bile lining come tighter together. We see the tight junctures being able to close the gap so that we don't end up with those food particles going into the bloodstream. And that's when we see miracles happen. So everybody needs to work on tightening their tight junctures and good astringent foods. We haven't actually gone into food examples yet, but I just want to say that if we look at something like mandarin skin extract, or even just eating some mandarin skin, that has a super astringent quality that's being researched for its ability to reduce leaky gut.
We're talking to Julie Daniluk, mealsthatheal.ca, thrivewithjulie.com, where you can join our supportive wellness community, or one of my favorite websites of all is literally juliedaniluk.com, where she makes it her mission to make it fun, easy, and way less stressful to have a healthy, anti-inflammatory diet. And again, most recently accomplished multi best-selling author, but Meals That Heal Inflammation. the gut, just keep coming back to the gut. And the contribution of dysbiosis, as you described, imbalanced gut bacteria, the tie into the immune system, the leakiness, translating to confused immunity and so forth. And we're talking, about the multitude of things that can manifest symptomologically, right, from that issue. You describe them in the book as 5 key signs. Just to be super clear, what should our
Mhm.
listeners look out for in their body to know that
Yeah.
inflammation's on its way up to causing serious problems, and maybe even they're already there?
Sure. So we've got redness, heat, pain, swelling, loss of function. So when I look at the redness, a lot of people ignore that their skin is simply a mirror into what's happening in their body. So when we see a lot of eczema, when we see a rosacea, when we see that sort of skin, don't ignore it. Really look deeper. And then when we're looking at heat, a lot of people will go, I don't really get the heat piece. Well, remember that when you have infections, you're going to spike a fever. But also, when you touch a knee that's super swollen, you'll often notice that it does have some heat qualities to it. And then the swelling, everyone thinks, oh, that means your ankle is big and swollen. No, also, let's look at the bloating that people are experiencing. Abdominal swelling is totally ignored as if it's a normal thing that everybody over the age of 20 is just going to have
Yeah.
swelling. Absolutely not. That means you definitely have a reaction going on to your food. And I have seen incredible things where when people embrace foods that agree with them, how the bloating just completely disappears.
Right.
And some people notice a dramatic just reduction in their weight because they're carrying up to 10 pounds of extra fluid on their system. So we're not losing fat right away. We're losing the inflammation, the swelling that's occurring on a person's body. And the pain, oh my gosh, I just am amazed at. I've actually started to understand a couple foods that I'm very allergic to. If I have them, the next day, one of my only Achilles heels in my body, which is when I was young, I was a dancer and I tore a labrum in my hip. And I will feel it like when I've had a food I'm allergic to. So please
Hmm.
don't explore those symptoms because it's normally fine, completely fine, but it starts to create this pain response when exposed to food allergies.
Hmm.
And then that loss of function. If all of a sudden you wake up and you're so stiff, you couldn't possibly touch your toes. Can we actually see that as an inflammation response that is something you don't want to accept? Because so many people are like, I'm just getting old. I'm like, have you seen the people in Okinawa, Japan? They're like out there on seaweed, actually harvesting it from a full squat. Like, we do not need to age out this way.
Right.
So many people are willing to accept this. And I'm just here to say we can have extraordinary flexibility well into our 90s.
Well, what are some of the top foods? Food is the most powerful healer that you talk about in the book. I mean, you've teased us with mandarin skin, and there's all kinds of exotic things.
Yes.
But some of these are really simple and easily found at your local grocer, and maybe your Asian produce center. But some nutrients that you recommend to fight inflammation on the daily, good for everybody, and
Sure.
maybe even those that have become more popularized because of the work of Dan Buttner and the blue zones and all these places where people live beyond
Mhm.
100.
Yeah. So I would say right off the top of my head, berries. So
Yeah.
blueberries, are so incredible. And we always give cranberries the credit for helping to kill H. pylori, but now blueberries are starting to really be seen as an amazing remedy for the stomach lining, but also helps to reduce UTIs,
Mhm.
increases the child's intelligence. Because that's the other thing is like people's attention span. I used to have ADHD as a child and it's in remission. And I have to say, like, brain inflammation is in that background of lost attention, lost memory, right? So, definitely increasing berries at a very high level. So, I have my dad and my mom eating an entire cup of frozen blueberries a day. And when you buy them certified organic, but frozen from a big box store to be named unnamed, you will notice how affordable it is to go that way. So a
Sure.
lot of people are like, I can't afford blueberries. I'm like, you can from the freezer department. They're often really a great buy. And don't cook the heck out of them. So just let them thaw out so that you have the maximum phytonutrients in there. And then I would absolutely follow that up with all the sources of omega-3. So whether that be flaxseed, whether that be, now flaxseed is tough because you have to convert ALA into EPA. EPA, I like to call, I have a little saying for it. It eats your pain away. So EPA is the pre-converted omega-3 that's extraordinary for pain reduction and has been shown to really reduce pain like a painkiller. In the real ability for it to, I see CRP levels, the C-reactive protein, highly sensitive, come down very dramatically when someone really embraces a good omega-3.
Right.
So I like, of course, fish sources are great. And whether somebody embraces like actually eating a lot of fish or whether we go with a good quality fish oil, just make sure that it's extremely well preserved, because you and I have a good friend, a fellow friend who's Mark St. Ange, who's educated us on like oxidized omega-3s go from anti-inflammatory to inflammatory. So we want to
Sure.
make sure it's really protected.
Well, on that note, I know you're a fan of food first, so am I. Do you feel where most people sit today on their omega-3 index, and that would be a red blood cell marker for, how well, just like vitamin D on blood, how well their bodies are saturated with omega-3, which are very anti-inflammatory.
Mhm.
Talk all about it in the book. But can you eat yourself into therapeutic range for the most part? Can you eat enough fish that's healthy and maybe mercury dioxin, furan free on the
No,
weekly?
that's my issue, is that so many people are attracted to the most delicious forms of fish, and they're larger. Because quite frankly, the best fish in the world are like anchovies, herring, sardines,
Right.
mackerel. Not too many people eating those,
No, get that
right?
off my
So
pizza.
exactly. So
My
that's
gluten-free, dairy-free, high lycopene tomato sauce pizza, by the way.
I love it. I love it. I just want to put in the substitutions, right? So we don't need to go without. I believe in a treat
Well,
every day versus a cheat day on the weekend. And you're living proof of that because I know how you eat. So,
sustainability within protocol, within practice. Many people think anti-inflammatory eating is restrictive. By the way, we should note for most folks when we're talking about food sensitivities vis-a-vis allergies, full-blown peanut, sends kids to the hospital, and this is very different than sensitivities, which don't necessarily have to do with what's healthy or not healthy.
mhm.
But when we think about anti-inflammatory, and we think restrictive, folks, I'm holding up Julie's book, Meals That Heal Inflammation. This thing is heavy. And like virtually every other page is the most delicious recipe that's healing, no matter what your ills. So it's certainly not restrictive, but and some elimination diets can be overwhelming, but there are some foods, and we refer to them more commonly these days as anti-nutrient containing foods, that probably the majority of us, given our DNA across the board, should be avoiding, like on the daily. And I think some of those are important for everyone to know, that we are making some blanket statements. What are those?
Okay. So in the book, I have a great anti nutrient chart that really helps you really decide what anti-nutrients you personally need to deal with. And like phytic acid, you can reduce that with cooking. Nightshades, it's very particular. So let me just quickly run through nightshades. That would be, are you sensitive to capsaicin, which is in peppers? Are you dealing with an issue with tomaline in tomatoes? Are you dealing with an issue with solanine in eggplants or potato? If you are, then that particular alkaloid is triggering a huge response within your immune system. And my experience as a clinician is that 1 in 10 people are triggered. If they have arthritis, about 1 in 10 of them need to be careful with a specific alkaloid in the nightshade family. So we just have to do a trial elimination to figure that out for you, because there's not really a test for that.
Hmm.
So we say, hey, in the book, I cut out all nightshades and then we put them back in one at a time. And I really try to start with tomato paste, because all that lycopene and all that wonderful nutrition within that, I want that back in early. And it opens up so many recipes and so much flavor that, don't worry, we're not going to take you off that for long. But when we look at potatoes, so many people eating potatoes in a very inflammatory way. We take a slice of potato and then we drop it in like oxidized rancid frying oil, and it creates this browning effect that's super high in acrylamide, and then we wonder why we're inflamed. So yeah, we're going to let go of some of those, but we're going to substitute it with other delicious ones so that people
Right.
don't feel deprived, right?
Well, that's what I love most about the book and most of your programs is there isn't just a switch out. There is a
Mhm.
more delicious thing you have not yet discovered, and probably more likely pluralized things that you have
Mhm.
not yet figured out. What we can come to an agreement around here, though, and what we're trying to share with folks is foods and habits that people should avoid altogether: processed sugar, refined carbohydrates, trans fats, and fried foods, gluten and dairy for the majority. And at the DNA Company, we test your HLA genes in our standard gold standard 360 test, which are not suggesting you have celiac. They do actually indicate whether or not you have celiac, but most people have at least sensitivities to
Mhm.
gluten, artificial additives, preservatives, alcohol. We should have that conversation, by the way. Everything in
Yeah.
moderation, including moderation itself, right? Winston Churchill's description. But
Who was a
then
massive
there's, was it? Okay.
Yes.
But,
Sorry.
so no, but listen, I mean, I think some of the blue zones, to come back to that group, and these are people that live all around the world, past 100, like you said, and they're squatting and doing exercise and planting and eating local and, blueberried out. Some of them, not all of them, but a large part of them are having one glass of red wine, usually produced locally, that seem to support the microbiome in a way that, something you'd buy at your local liquor store might not. That's filled with preservatives and, you
Mhm.
know, but, I guess where the literature is sort of trending toward is that alcohol can be pro-inflammatory. Of course, anything when it's consumed in high amounts can be. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, there's a lot of news flow around that these days that we just got to cut it out altogether.
I really think it does come down to your predisposition to inflammation. For example, there's now no safe limit if you have a high cancer risk.
Hmm.
So because ethanol does promote cancer. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But I hear you that there is very high nutrition in red wine. That is certainly like the home brew that they've crushed with their own feet. Of course, is going to have much higher antioxidants. So I think for an average person out there, instead of thinking like we used to think it was 1 to 2 glasses a day, and
Yeah,
now
that's
the
maybe too
new
much.
recommendations are sort of like 1 to 2 glasses a week.
Hmm.
So we just have kind of seen a shift in the literature around that.
Yeah,
But
some people are doing it daily, right? And
yeah.
listen, we have to, I have to acknowledge that there's, maybe a quarter glass of wine's worth of alcohol, ethanol, in a ripe banana. So, I mean, it's about the amount. And of course, if like you're suggesting, teetering on or on the heels of a diagnosed condition where any additional toxin is going to throw you over or provoke.
Mhm.
Listen,
Yeah.
at the DNA Company, we test for detoxification capabilities. That is to say, one's pathways, as you know well,
Mhm.
of genetic, glutathionization. So the process for the liver to handle not just the plumes of smoke that we deal with from manufacturing and
Yeah.
industrialized city concentrations and cars and blah blah blah, but the in endogenous inflammation that's ultimately a result of toxin exposure to just
Mm.
living and breathing, right? We live, we
Yeah.
eat, we breathe, we make toxins, and our
Yeah.
ability to do that varies across the board genetically.